Well, hi all. This is Brother Lauren. I'm here in our sanctuary here today at First Methodist Church in Yazoo City. And as I look around the sanctuary, it is a beautiful building. As we enjoy it every Sunday, we can't help but sit back and marvel at the architecture and the stained glass windows. And every time I look at this sanctuary, I stand in awe of the craftsmanship and the beauty that's gone into it. And I especially marvel at the fact that all of this was done back in 1907. The artistry that was put into this building from all the way back over a century ago. Some of the things they did, we couldn't do it exactly the same way today. There are methods of building they used. We don't even use those methods, where you couldn't get the materials to do what they've done. And yet, as I look at the beauty of the sanctuary, I marvel all the more that for as beautiful as it wasn't even our first sanctuary building on this site. That actually, this is a replacement sanctuary. That sadly, we're told in our church history for our congregation that the first sanctuary building had just been completed in 1904, right before we had the 1905 fire sweep through downtown Yazoo City, and it burned down everything, including our brand new, beautiful, just built sanctuary building for First Methodist Church here in Yazoo City. It's heartbreaking. And then they gathered together in the aftermath of that, and on the exact same spot, they rebuilt it, and we consecrated it in 1907, this beautiful sanctuary that here we are using to this very day. But you sometimes forget that's not even our first location. That if you look back in the history of our congregation, this church was actually founded in 1828 here in Yazoo City. And when we were founded in 1828, would you believe we weren't United Methodist? Sometimes we forget that the Methodist denomination has a long history, and that our United Methodist part of it is really not all that long ago. So you kind of look at the history of our church just a little bit with it, and one of the things you'll note is we weren't always United Methodist. We were founded back in 1828, and when you look back at 1828, what you find is, back in those days, we were founded as part of what was called the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, one of the things that kind of gets missed in that is that we are the first denomination of Methodists when it was founded in 1784. The American Methodists are actually the first of that. John Wesley, throughout all of his ministry in the 1700s over in England, he never actually founded a separate church. He never started a new denomination. He never actually intended for Methodists to be separate from the Church of England. And we might easily forget that John Wesley himself never actually left the Church of England. He was an ordained priest, pastor like me in that sense, in the Church of England. And he stayed an ordained priest and member of the Church of England to his last breath. He never left it, and he never gave permission for the Methodist movement in England to leave the Church of England. He always kind of envisioned it as what we might call today a parachurch ministry. It was a revival and renewal movement from within the Church of England. And so all throughout his lifetime until he died in 1791, he maintained that this should always be a part of the Church of England. It's only several years later that the British Methodists will form a separate denomination. We as Americans had to speed that up. He wasn't thrilled about it, but we had to, because there's a little thing that happened in 1776 that changed everything. You remember our American Revolutionary War. And part of the American Revolution was that when it was done, you really couldn't have a Church of England church here in the United States of America, which creates a problem for two different groups of Anglicans. You've got the Church of England Anglicans proper. Well, they're still wanting to hold church here in the United States, but again, they can't call themselves Church of England in the United States. That's just not going to work. So they need to do what we might call today rebranding. They rebranded themselves. They thought about it and go, well, how do we distinguish ourselves from all the other churches that are here in the United States? And they realized, well, most of those churches and denominations were congregational. They were different in that sense. the Anglicans always had bishops. And they said, well, the bishops are what set us apart. And the old Greek word for bishop is episkopos. So they decided we'll call ourselves the Episcopal Church. So when you look around and you see our Episcopal Church here in town, that's why they call themselves Episcopal. They're Old Church of England, who renamed themselves the Episcopal Church because they have bishops. Well, we as Methodists have always been a part of the Church of England. But after the American Revolution, we didn't want to be a part of the Church of England any longer. We didn't even want to be a part of the Episcopal Church as it formed. So we decided to start our own denomination, to be a separate church. Of course, what do we call ourselves? What name do you possibly give it? Well, we're Methodist, we know that much. But you know, we've always been a part of the Anglicans, and well, the American Anglicans are now calling themselves the Episcopal Church. Maybe we should call ourselves the Methodist Episcopal Church. And so that was our new denomination. And it started at the Christmas Conference of 1784, very much at the beginning, and Francis Asbury was our first bishop, and we've been a part of that ever since. Now in 1828, when we were founded, we were a part of that Methodist Episcopal Church. Only, you know, we didn't stay that very long. We weren't even 20 years in as Methodist Episcopal as a church before our denominational affiliation changed. You can see it here on our outline. 1844, we had a church split. Now, 1844 is about 20 years before the Civil War. And the argument and debate over owning of slaves in the United States was pretty fierce. And there was a line in the Book of Discipline then, and it's still in there to a certain degree now, that John Wesley forbid any Methodist in any of his gatherings to own slaves. That was in our Book of Discipline from all the way at 1784. Methodist members cannot own slaves. But that had kind of been loosened up a little bit. By and large, people had relaxed that rule. They hadn't been keeping that strictly. Lots of members, especially in the southern states, owned slaves, counter to what the Book of Discipline said. Not exactly the best, but it's what it was. Where it came to a head is, as it often does, a bishop owned a slave. Actually, he owned a couple by the time it came up. And in the General Conference of 1844, they called him on it. And the northern states wanted to remove him as bishop. And he actually consented to resign his credentials and to step away from being bishop. He was going to leave his ordination status over it. However, the southern states objected and said, no, we don't want you to do that. And instead, they threatened to secede. That 1844 General Conference was a knockdown, drag-out fight. It was said to be the longest General Conference ever held. And when it was all said and done, there was an uneasy division of the church into north and south. It was messy. There was a lot of acrimony and hard feeling. And there was litigation that followed. They didn't all abide by the rules they'd set at the General Conference. Lawyers and judges had to get involved. Civil courts had to resolve things. But when all the dust settled of it, we were split into two churches. There's the Methodist Episcopal Church. Those were the northern states. And there's what you see here called the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And all the southern states went with it, and so did we. Our little congregation, along with all the Mississippi Annual Conference of its time, went with that southern collection, calling ourselves the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Which is why if you ever go and look at old churches throughout Mississippi or elsewhere in the South, you may see on the foundation stone, or on the little placard going over the top of the church, a little thing that says, such and such church and the South. Well, that's what that stands for. Now, we were a part of that from 1844 onward, until you'll see it there in 1939, the Methodist Episcopal Church in the north, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and then also a group called the Methodist Protestant. All three of them merged together to reunite and form what we call the Methodist Church. Now, that's the church some of y'all were first members of. There are a few of you in this congregation that if you think back on it, when you first got baptized, or you got confirmed as a brand new member when you were 12 or 13, you were confirmed or baptized into the Methodist Church. That's what we were when you first joined it. Actually, that's what our marker on the side of the building says. We're First Methodist Church. That's why it doesn't have United in it. It's not that we've left out the United to be mean. It's just that's what it was when that sign was bolted onto our building. We're First Methodist Church because that's what it was from 1939 onward. And that carried all the way up to 1968 most recently. Actually, I've got 1969, my apology, typo. But 1968, we had a church merger between the Methodist Church and the EUB, the Evangelical United Brethren, which was an old German Methodist group that had been in the United States for years. And those two merged together to form the United Methodist Church, which is in fact where the United comes from. We're called United Methodists not because we have such togetherness and always get along. Rather, the United is a kind of a tip of the cap, a recognition of the old Evangelical United Brethren. That United represents their connection, the United Brethren churches as they formed through the years. And so we became United Methodist. And that's been our connection really ever since. We're 54 years old as a denomination. So we were 1828, we were a Methodist Episcopal Church. 1844, we went with a major church split to be the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And then 1939, we merged back together to become the Methodist Church. And in 1968, we became the United Methodist Church. Now I find that fascinating because that tells us something. We haven't always been United Methodist. In fact, we've been part of 4 different denominations in our almost 200-year history. In 4 years, we'll celebrate our bicentennial. 200 years as a Methodist church. But we've been 4 different denominations. Methodist Episcopal South, the Methodist Church, and then the United Methodist Church. 4 different denominations. Now that tells us something. These things happen from time to time. There are denominational changes, mergers, as well as splits and divisions that happen from time to time. In fact, one of the more instructive things that brings up is that there have been many times where groups have broken away from or split or divided from the Methodist movement or church as it's been through our history. So for instance, I give you just an example of a few of the church splits in Methodist history. Remember, 1784 is when we were formed as the Methodist Episcopal Church. 1828, the Methodist Protestant Church broke away. Now remember, it'll merge back with us in 1939, but in 1828, they broke away. Not long after that, you get in 1843, the Wesleyan Church. For a long time, they were known as the Wesleyan Methodist Church. They are now known as the Wesleyan Church, and they're mostly a northern denomination. They broke away partly over owning of slaves and some other matters, and they're still around today. I went to seminary with a couple of people who are ordained pastors in the Wesleyan Church. 1852, you have the Congregational Methodist Church. They didn't like having bishops. They wanted to be Congregationalists, kind of like the Baptists, and so they formed the Congregational Methodist Church. Do you know there are Congregational Methodist churches right in Mississippi? You may have run into them from time to time if you keep an eye out. In 1860, right before the Civil War, the Free Methodist Church broke away. And they broke away over 3 things. They broke away because they didn't believe in owning slaves, so they were against slavery. That's why they're mostly a northern church. They separated from the Northern Methodist Episcopal Church. But likewise, they also didn't believe in you owning your pew. Back in the old days, we used to actually sell the pews. I tease some of y'all about this sometimes, that they would charge you for your pew on an annual basis. Instead of tithing or giving to the church, we would make you rent your pew. And so you would literally have a family pew, and certain pews cost more than others. If we did that today, those back 2 pews are going to cost a lot of money, because some of y'all are fighting for that. But everyone would have their pew, and you'd have to pay for it. That raised a question for the Free Methodists in it. They said, well, where do the poor people sit? Also, when you're in a segregated world, forgive it, but where do the black people or the non-white people sit? It created a lot of tension to it, and they said, well, that shouldn't be. We're the church. You should be able to walk in and sit anywhere for free. Otherwise, how's someone who's lost going to find God's saving grace? So they broke away and formed the Free Methodist Church. And one of their other concerns, like with the Wesleyan Church and a couple of the others, is they were very strong on entire sanctification. They believed very heavily in the second work of grace and the work of the Holy Spirit working holiness in us. They're a part of that holiness movement within the church overall. So in 1860, the Free Methodists broke away. And then in 1865, the Salvation Army broke away from the British Methodist Church over in London, England. Now, many of us, we may not realize the Salvation Army that's all around us, they used to be Methodist. But actually, the Salvation Army was founded by William Booth, who was an actual British Methodist pastor, had a congregation in London, England. And he got into trouble because he had a big downtown church and a beautiful church with lots of people in it. But he had a heart for the poor and the homeless and the lost. And he went out and gathered poor homeless people off the street and would bring them into church. It'd be kind of like me going over in our town to over where the library is and the post office and Manor House, and gathering up all the homeless people sitting around and bringing them in and putting them on the first two pews of our church on Sunday. He had good stately Methodists who objected to that and said, no, we don't want those people sitting there, especially not up front. They felt standoffish about all of that. They didn't like that practice. And he argued with them. He says, well, if they're not welcome here, where will they be welcome? And if we're not bringing in the poor and the homeless and the lost, how will they ever be saved? And if we're not going to do that, what's the point of being a church? And they argued about it until finally he said, fine. He resigned and turned in his credentials, and he went and started his own church, which he ended up naming the Salvation Army. Now, you may not realize that they're a very conservative branch of the Methodist Church, and they believe very strongly in holiness, entire sanctification. They want every person they bring off the street not only to be fed and housed, but they want everyone to hear the gospel and get saved and sanctified. They've cooled on that a little bit through the years. Like a lot of denominations, they're struggling with a bit of secularization at this time. But still, that was their heart, and they broke away in 1865. And then you look in 1908, the Nazarene Church broke away, very conservative branch of the church. And you can still find Nazarene churches all throughout Mississippi. And then in 1946, the Evangelical Methodist Church broke away. And you'll find a few examples of those, but they're a much smaller denomination yet. And that's just 6 or 7 churches right there that have broken away from us. Some of them bigger, some of them smaller as denominations. Some of them you'll know about, others of them you've never heard before I mention them. And I could give you a half dozen more that are smaller, that have come and gone, and you've never seen them, you've probably never heard of them. They're all around. Like one I didn't mention that's a very small group of recent vintage is the Independent Methodist Church. We've got one of those in Yazoo City. There's an Independent Methodist Church of Yazoo City right here in town. We've got lots of different groups that have broken away. Now here's the takeaway I want you to get out of that. These kind of things our denomination's going through right now, they happen from time to time. What we're going through, this isn't the first time it's happened, and it won't be the last time it's happened. In fact, I guess even a comforting thing to take out of it, if you can take comfort, is we've actually lived through one of these before. Remember, in 1844, we went through the divide between the Northern Church and the Southern Church. Right or wrong, good or bad, the church divided. Now, it did eventually reunite one day, but for a long time, they divided and they were separate. We lived through that. We were one of the breakaway churches at that time. It's just how it was. These things happen from time to time. And you can look at it from one of two sides of it. For the churches that break away, they can take comfort in the fact that, well, this isn't the first time it's happened. Every so often we have one of these divides, and Churches leave the Methodist Church in whatever form it is, whether it's Methodist Episcopal, Methodist Church, or United Methodist. These things happen from time to time. It's not the first time this has happened. And so there's a long history of those churches breaking away. And many of those denominations, like the Free Methodist and the Wesleyan and the Nazarene, they're still around to this day. Healthy, strong, active denominations reaching people for Jesus, serving the Lord. And while there was acrimony between us and them at one time, we've all reconciled our differences, and the United Methodist Church has a friendly relationship with all of those denominations, and we recognize them as valid denominations these days. So for those churches breaking away now, they can take heart that this has happened before, and those denominations are still healthy and strong to varying degrees. But also, there's always been a segment that stayed behind, and they're still there. The Methodist Church became the United Methodist, and for all those groups that have broken away through the years, they're still a Methodist church. They're still a United Methodist Church. And I would encourage, for those that stay United Methodist in this time, even after all the sorting out is done with what the United Methodist Church is going through right now, there's still going to be a United Methodist Church. It will continue on, and it will be, to some varying degree, a strong church in its own regard. This won't be the end of the United Methodist Church. I just find that helpful for kind of getting perspective on what our denomination is going through right now and what our congregation is considering. It's not the first time these things have happened. It's not the last time these things have happened. And we haven't always been United Methodist. Goodness, we've been 4 different denominations. I guess our question is, we just need to discern for us, how are we going to navigate this time for us? Now, this is the first in a little video series I'm going to do here, kind of exploring these kind of things and the how and the why of what our United Methodist Church is going through right now. If you liked this video and found it helpful, I would encourage you to hit the like button down below. If you're not subscribed, I'd encourage you to think about hitting the subscribe button and subscribing so that you get these kind of things when they come out, along with our normal Sunday service. If you have a comment or a question, feel free to put those in the comments section down below. I will do my best to get to those. If you have a topic you would like me to consider as part of this in a future video, put that down below. Or better yet, if you like, most all of you, you have my cell phone number, or you know how to reach me through the church office. Call me, text me. You can send me an email, but probably text or call is best. Or also know my office door is always open. So if you want to come by and talk, or you want me to come and meet with you as a small group, I can come and meet with you, or you can come and meet with me, and I'd be more than glad to answer whatever questions you may have in this time. Do know my door's always open. So until next time, we'll look at some other things in an upcoming video just shortly. But until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day, and God bless.